think that in this new scenario of this waiting period, we have now an India that has improved in the legal frameworks of foreign investment, that is opening to this foreign investment, that, as many have mentioned, including Her Excellency that had to leave, and Jeffrey, all of these projects make India, Smart India, and recently an ATA certificate to SMEs that seems like a minor thing, but it's very important in the trading globally. So all of these and other initiatives that India is bringing to the table is not lost time, it's just gain time, because it will make easier the process now when we engage in joining together efforts. I was very pleased that Samir Saran mentioned in these issues, as I did tell him, the digital FTA and the ethical privacy, because this is very technological, okay? And this is something that we have not to forget, that we are in a world where the latest industrial revolution is taking place. So let's not forget about that. So independently, as our chairman always says, don't forget about the traditional and the older companies that give us food, manufacturing, infrastructures, but we cannot say that technology is not here. So in that line, regarding the privacy and identity that he was mentioning that Europe is embracing, really in the United States tried to embrace it through Obama, but that is a lost task now. And only MIT is embracing the Enigma and the Opal projects, which were presented to him as the leadership in privacy and the protection. And the technologies that are there to be able to guarantee anonymity of your data when they travel around, and guarantee that you are the owner and you can decide who you give your data to, that is entailing all of these privacy issues, involves blockchain, involves public ledger protected being immune, involves multiple-party computation, involves differential privacy, which is one of the only ones that guarantees anonymity today, and it was developed by a woman. I always like to note when it is an invention of a woman, okay? She's work, and she comes from Microsoft. And then we have the cybersecurity and new cryptography homomorphic embedding, which comes from a man from MIT, which is Mr. Craig Gentry. All of these technologies are already there for the taking. So I think that those of us who understand them, who have used them in our trade, okay, we are not unique in Europe. India is also doing that. But probably if we join forces and we work together in all of these issues, we might together, Europe and India, present a proposition in parallel to the US and China, okay? So we need to join for the future, to be really leaders as the US and now China seem to be doing. So with respect to the issues that bother me most, and I think that somebody was saying earlier that they are very much involved in SMEs and also in SMEs in rural areas. I am worried about the use of this tissue of economic growth, which are SMEs, because 98% of the companies in Europe are SMEs, 99 really, and I guess India has the same very, very high percentage of tissue also are SMEs. So we need to use them, we need to grow them, we need to help them. And I'm more worried on women building SMEs. So we cannot use them in of course, India is I'm more worried on leading women. Some of the European countries are doing better than others. So we cannot use them in of course, India I'm more worried on leading women. Some of the European, we are the largest growing country. So we cannot use them in of course, India I'm more worried on leading women. Some of the European, we are the largest growing country. So we cannot use them in of course, India I'm more worried on leading women. Some of the European, we are the largest growing country. So we cannot use them in of course, India I'm more worried on leading women. Some of the European, we are the largest. Opportunities in technology are are enormous. I am interested in those. And there is, of course, the related, how do we skill? How do we prepare people for the technological challenges? We're coming to a world where robots, software robots, and artificial intelligence is going to eliminate 50% of the labor work spaces as we know today. So how are we going to build those skills? And certainly not with traditional skilling techniques. We will need new skilling techniques. The jobs is going to be on demand and volatile. They're not going to be positions that you keep. They're going to be bidding with rewards models. So they're going to be short and they're going to be based on performance. There's not going to be any model where, you know, remuneration is going to be based on your credentials. Remuneration is going to be based on your provability. How do you prove that you know that skill? So there's new models coming out. The MOOC has not been a success because they placing the old courses in the internet. That doesn't help. We have to also make a revolution in the type of courses that we do. There's a company, Coursera, that is doing a great job, and they did great work with AT&T. AT&T had to revolutionize and reskill its labor work completely in the new telecom technologies that came into being. And they can, as fast as 4-week time, prepare 7-week courses of specialized skills. Which educational institution in our countries can do that? It has to go through the board of the university. It has to go to the Ministry of Education. It has to go to the changing of pensum. And when we are reminded of what we requested 4 years ago, it's no longer valid. So we need these new accelerators of defining, and so there's a great opportunity there for India and for Europe to work together in these new models of skilling for the future. And I think this is very important. So on the last part, of course, what are the skills that we need? And the World Economic Forum has done a study, and the two basic skills that have the largest percentage for 2020 is problem solving with above 30%, and social skills around 18%. So those are the two more important skills that the new labor spaces are going to be needing. And how do we define problem solving? It's like artificial intelligence. How we define artificial intelligence if we don't even know what natural intelligence is, okay? But problem solving is just the capacity to formalize a problem, try to see what are the things that I know about it, the things that I don't know, make hypotheses, make a path for a solution and try to solve it. So usually the STEM careers, science, engineering, mathematics, and all of these technology positions, and education, classical education in engineering, mathematics, and physics, do guarantee that you go through the process of being able to learn the skills of problem solving, because they teach you the scientific method, okay? And that's one way. But that's not the only way. I mean, there are kids that don't like, you know, their mathematics and the geometry, but they can use the logic in a different way. They like rhetorics, they like debate, so they can use the language for using the logics, okay? They can also use the language itself. We can use the syntactic infrastructure of the language, which is very logical. We have subject, predicate, whatever, and we have the rules. And if we follow that, we are using our first order logic of our mind. So we have to be thinking about that. It is an ambiguous future. We don't even know what is coming after that industrial revolution. We don't know what are going to be the professions that are going to be created after 50% of the professions today being destructive. I mean, the destruction is there for sure. So we have to be prepared, you know, like a Renaissantist guy, you know, that knew a little bit about everything and not very much about profoundly one thing. So this is where I think the opportunities are. If we look at the future, if we look that Europe has skills to help in that opportunity and India together, if we both join, I think we can, you know, prepare both communities into the future in a better world. I think I leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I thought that the session was more on the bilateral trade, but you took us really a step beyond, in the sense that there are other issues also, so that they should not be ignored, in terms of particularly what is happening now in Industrial Revolution 4. You reminded us of that. Incidentally, talking about women SMEs, it was only very recently in India, at Hyderabad, we had the Global Global Entrepreneurs Summit. It's kind of a US baby, and Ivanka Trump was there. It was a very big event, and the theme was on women entrepreneurs. I wish you were there. May I invite next speaker, Mr. Peter Burrs. Burrs? Have I got the pronunciation right? Peter. Peter. Please. 15 minutes?
Well, the whole panel is 30 minutes, so I don't want to take too much time here, but...
very good.
12:30 we have to end this session, 12:30.
12:30?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so I take a step back and talk about the free trade agreement negotiations. That's what everybody wants to hear, where we stand, etc. Thanks for having me here. Just a little bit of background. We are negotiating with India. We have launched these negotiations based on a mandate which is now more than 10 years old. 10 years ago we have decided under Commissioner Peter Mandelson to engage with India, but also with ASEAN and Korea. While we have finalized and finished Korea some years ago, the negotiations with India are still ongoing. We have been actively negotiating until about 2013, and then we realized that our ambitions differ too much to bring these negotiations to a successful end. In 2014, of course, Modi came, and then since 2016, we are trying to have another look at how we can revitalize the negotiations. A boost came, of course, to the recent EU-India summit, where Prime Minister Modi and President Juncker also discussed the way forward on these negotiations. President Juncker clearly said we are ready to resume these negotiations, quote, once the conditions are right. So what are these conditions? On one hand, the economic rationale, I don't have to make the case, you heard that in the previous panel, that there's an economic case. Our trade relationship is healthy, is balanced, is growing, and the question is now, is there potential which we have not tapped yet on, which we like to untap with our effort to have a free trade agreement? How can we negotiate a win-win agreement? On the EU side, we of course always want an FTA that is deep, ambitious, and comprehensive, meaning comprehensive, covering all areas of our trade and investment relationship, be it not only the market access part in goods, services, investment and procurement, but also the different sets of rules for intellectual property rights, for competition, for SPS measures, sanitary and phytosanitary measures, technical measures, but also then disciplines on trade and sustainable development, which include labor protection, environmental rights, etc. That's a comprehensive element. The deep element is, of course, we want to go deep. We don't want to have shallow FTAs. We want to have them as deep as possible, which, for example, in the tariff area means eliminate as close as possible to 100% of tariff in tariff lines and in the products covered by these tariff lines. Then we have a lot to offer. We can offer to India to open our market even further to India's interests. And what does India want? In our view from the European Commission, there are things, what one Indian colleague once told me, the three mobilities. Mobility of goods, meaning basically the market access bit, in terms of exporting to the EU market, and here we talk tariffs. The mobility of persons, that is basically what we call it in the services area, the mode 4 element, sending workers like IT specialists to Europe to perform services in the European market. And the mobility of data, which is basically also a backbone of the services industry, where India pursues the recognition of being a country that has data protection adequate or comparable to the one in the European Union. This is an element which we don't negotiate. So part of an FTA, data protection rules, we have our And for export to the EU, or export to the huge Indian market, there are some questions mark as well. Is India producing for exports, producing first to its own market? Does it want to have investment in India to serve the Indian market rather than to export? We also have signals that go not in the way we wish. Government procurement is getting more and more tighter because we can't enter the Indian market for government procurement contracts as India can do in the EU, and it's getting stricter to get into the Indian procurement market. A lot of our exports of fruits and meat are blocked by Indian authorities for health standards, for technical standards. We are engaging with India a lot to solve these issues, but I can tell you it's extremely difficult. I mean, we are difficult when it comes to the 75% measures, but try to negotiate with India. Tariffs increasing. India increases its tariffs for our exports, for example, on several IT products. India also goes in the direction that it affects the reimbursement of costs for medical equipment, like medical devices, where our companies also complain that it's going the wrong way in India. We want to have more freer trade, and India doesn't show us these signals. And then, of course, tariffs. Just imagine we are facing a country that has, in many cases, prohibitive tariffs. If you pay 100% import duty for cars and car parts, for your exports of wine and spirits, and these are industries India wishes to protect, and continue to protect and build up its own industries, then it's very difficult to come here to a solution that serves both sides. So how can we bridge the gap between the EU interest in exporting to India, anticipating and tendering procedures, for example, and India's ambition to attract investment, to pursue its Make in India policy, but somehow blocking the direct export of goods from the European Union, just to give you an example where we are struggling to find a common ground with India. So, following the summit, what we call chief negotiators on both sides continue to meet. We just did a meeting in Delhi the other week. We had a lot of engagement, good engagement. We have a certain new dynamic in this process following the last summit. So these discussions will continue and go deep into different areas to see then at the end, beginning of next year, middle of next year, whether the time is ripe so that we see eye to eye, that we can possibly announce the relaunch of these negotiations. In the meantime, of course, we are checking also where is India positioning itself in light of the US policy in India, the Chinese policy in Asia. What is the impact of the elections? Are we already in a pre-election mode? Or, as somebody said yesterday in a conference, Modi doesn't have to look at anybody else, he can just push through his reform agenda. Is that helpful for our process, or is it rather a process that needs more time on the Indian side as well to be able to see eye to eye with us? So these are question marks, and I'm happy to hear comments from the audience as well on these.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I took 5 minutes. 5 minutes, because Peter's done the background of where we are with the FTA. Madhi Sharma, European Economic and Social Committee, was the rapporteur for the EU-India FTA civil society input. So my first point is that the Commission does a sustainable impact assessment on the free trade agreements before the negotiations start. It only covers the 8% formal sector. So 92% of the economy is completely ignored. That's something that I would like corrected, because if the EU increases poverty or increases human rights abuses, we are guilty of a crime. So we have a due diligence to prove that we are not increasing poverty and human rights abuses. Point 1. Point 2, I am extremely concerned that 2 of the greatest democracies in the world cannot find a solution by which a trade agreement can be done. for the benefit of both sides. Point 3. I am shocked with the hypocrisy of the European Union when it comes to trade. And I'm going to take a specific case study. And I am not saying this because I am Indian. I am saying this because I am a human being who cares about human rights. GSP Plus is given to Pakistan. In order to have GSP Plus, you have to comply with 27 international core conventions on human rights, on torture, on executions, on labour rights, on women's rights, on child rights, to name a few. We have evidence that up to 13 of these international core conventions are being violated. There is a monitoring and evaluation report done by the European Commission every 2 years. The next one will be out at the end of January 2018. Who does the assessment? An independent consultant. Who do they go to talk to? The government of Pakistan. That's where the evidence comes from. There are huge concerns raised by the European Commission, raised by the Commission on Human Rights inside Europe, raised by Amnesty International, by Human Rights Watch, raised by DG Development, DG Justice, and yet we still allow Pakistan to have GSP Plus despite all these violations. Now, I can accept that Pakistan is a very specific case, and as neighbours to India, we want to know that it's secure. It's very important. But when we are being told that Pakistan is taking GSP preference from Europe, and yet is giving Gawadia port to the Chinese for 40 years, tax-free of import and export taxes, I think the European Union should be analysing what it's doing. And they are my concerns, because as a human being who believes very much in Europe and the European values on which Europe was founded, I believe we are not only violating the human rights of people inside Pakistan, but we are violating the values on which the European Union was founded. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was quite swift. But if I am not mistaken, you are British.
I'm British.
Of Indian origin.
My father's Punjabi.
Right.
I'm a proud Punjabi. You can see from the nose.
No. No, my point is, the point which I was coming to, since you mentioned you are Indian, and so on. So what I wanted to understand was, how would this EU-India FTA negotiations pan out, considering the exit of UK from EU? And the fact is that, what is the percentage of trade today between EU and India as far as Britain is concerned? Do you have any numbers?
No.
Is it not substantial, Peter?
It's substantial, but there will be a session this afternoon tackling exactly that question.
Exactly that question. Right. No. Why I asked this question is the fact is this throws up a new dynamic in the context of the. One did hear in the morning that one of the proposals of India on Mode 4 were being objected to by UK, particularly in the earlier negotiations, may be watered down now that UK will not be there in the European Union. But I don't know how does this whole process take place until such time that Britain is out of the EU. I mean, I've been reading about it, that this discomfort in the sense that Britain can participate in all the committees, yet the fact is that they will not be around at a later date to do that. Now, Peter, what I would like to ask you is, what do you think is the way forward? In the sense that I've heard statements about, I mean, there are three areas, if I'm not mistaken. Government procurement, have you given up your demand on TRIPS Plus, I hope? And in three contentious areas. Automobiles is something which there is a red line as far as India is concerned. It is part of the Make in India program. It will not lower the tariff to allow import of automobiles. And then that, again, is now going to be further influenced by the factors that you're looking at electric cars, electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles, which are now going to be the new norm. And as we heard in the morning in terms of the seriousness of Government of India on climate change, including giving up fossil fuel, they made very serious commitments, and we've already sort of, in terms of solar energy, we are probably one of the most advanced nations in the world, including other than the fact that we are hosting the International Solar Alliance. So that has a relationship with the existing automobiles sector. And the third is government procurement. What I hear is, or even SPSTBT, that seems to be a two-sided, two-way game. I mean, there are problems on both the sides. So my own experience with EU administration quite often was that rules were applied without a sense of proportionality on the guise of consumer issues, but when we speak to consumer organizations, they do not see it as such a major contribution.
Okay, there's lots of stuff. So let's focus on the way forward. I mean, for every FTA negotiations, you have to have a situation where both sides feel comfortable to start these negotiations and to bring them to an end. We are in some kind of a middle phase. We have tried to negotiate. We said, let's take a pause and reflect on our priorities, on our defensive issues, on our offensive issues. Time has moved on as well, so we are now in a process where we engage with the Indian side to explain what we want to see from India, what we want to see in such an FTA. And we base ourselves not on what we have discussed with India 10 years ago. In the meantime, we have moved on as well. We have negotiated and concluded agreements, or concluded negotiations with Japan, with Canada, with Vietnam, with Singapore. These are very ambitious FTAs, and of course we think that India, who has also negotiated various FTAs, can also live up to these standards. Of course, it's all a question of level of ambition, how deep you want to go in liberalizing, how much you want to engage. We are not in the business anymore of talking of shallow FTAs, just a little bit on tariffs and rules of origin, a little bit of agriculture, and then you have an FTA. These FTAs are much more comprehensive. And it's not just procurement and tariffs, it has a package. And the package goes both ways. So India has to feel comfortable as well that it can pursue its offensive interests by protecting its defensive interests, and the same goes on our side. So the question is, where's the middle ground between these two? And this comfort zone we haven't reached yet with the Indians, but we're on a good track to have a process of engagement, and we're very pleased with the latest engagement we had with the Indian authorities 2 weeks ago in Delhi, where all the relevant agencies and specialists came and met our experts, engaged in all these areas, and we have to continue these negotiations now, or these discussions in the spring, until chief negotiators will have another chance to look at the bigger issues as well, for example, the tariff side, the procurement side, but also trade and sustainable development, something India is not used to negotiating trade agreements. So the respect for international conventions, it's not EU norms and ideas, and it's international labor organizations conventions, multilateral environmental conventions, where we want to see that India also lives up to its commitments and we want to push them a bit more in respect of labor rights. So India is not used to negotiating trade agreements, so there's another hurdle we have to overcome to see eye to eye with India. On Brexit, of course, I'm not authorized to talk Brexit. We have strict instructions there. But it's oh, there's nothing off the record. I learned that already when you talk Brexit. No, but this is a question many of our FTA partners ask us, or negotiating partners, what what's the process now? Are you still negotiating on behalf of 28 or 27, etc.? And at the moment, of course, we have a mandate to negotiate on behalf of 28 member states. We don't know how the future relationship will look like, and therefore we don't know what to negotiate with third countries on the basis of an EU of 27. We have to see the next couple of months how this will develop. In the meantime, we are negotiating, of course, in Geneva already the different schedules the UK has to submit to the WTO on liberalization, etc. But we are not there yet in the bilateral front, the bilateral FTA front, how to address this issue. This will be an issue for those agreements already in force, like the Korea FTA. Those agreements we have negotiated but not yet concluded, like our agreements with Vietnam, Singapore, Japan, and then our future agreements like with India, Australia, New Zealand, and that they all need perhaps some kind of adjustment. Technically speaking, of course, the agreement is valid in the territory of the EU. On the day of Brexit, UK is no longer covered by this. But there is, of course, the fear we always had is that FTA partners say, okay, without the UK, first of all, what you offer us is no longer as good as it was with the UK. And secondly, many think that India's main interest is the UK market when it comes to traditionally services, perhaps goods. But when we talk to our trading partners, including India, they all confirm that the interest in FTA with the EU remains the same with or without the UK. So that is a good confirmation, and nobody said, oh, no, we don't want to negotiate with the EU anymore, let's focus on an FTA with the UK. Nobody said that. So.
No, I agree, but I just wanted to interrupt you here. There is another very important dynamic which I have seen in terms of the processes in India. The Commerce Ministry, there is also seductive overtures from the UK for a potential FTA with India. And it will be the same officers who will be dealing with EU and UK FTAs.
I don't know what the Indian ministry says.
That's what I'm saying.
It's the same minister, I guess.
No, not only minister, but usually it will be the same set of bureaucrats.
There are many of them in India. Yes.
No, there are not many. You know, looking at the size of our country, our trade policy department is so small. It's a pity. Our foreign service is so small.
But they are very good.
Yeah, but you know, there's been a strong move to expand both, but nothing's happening. And secondly, particularly trade policy department, a long-term argument that we've been making is to professionalize it. So they have the same bureaucrats who are running it without any understanding about the nitty-gritties of negotiation. But anyway, that said, should we conclude? Can I take one or two questions?
Yeah, one or two, yes, sir.
Yes, please.
This is for Regina. You talked about the...
You know, Mike? Please make a very sharp and succinct question so that we can move ahead fast.
Thank you for... It's okay, I can speak out.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your thoughts for all the panels. I would like to ask this question for the future generation in terms of revolution which is happening and how the skills needs to be focused considering this change from the conventional industry to the artificial industry which is coming and threatening all of us. So luckily we have lived up, but I don't know how many people are actually going to see here less than 20-25 in this room will actually look forward in the next 20 years, 30 years. So what kind of skills will help them to survive?
Thank you. I'll take one or two more questions and then we, Rajesh. Yeah, please go ahead. Well, there's one at the back. There are two at the back. Fine. So could you...
Would you like to respond first?
No, later.
I'm focusing on an objective of this session.
Hello?
Go ahead.
No,
it doesn't matter.
So,
Can I chair the session?
Yes.
Can I moderate?
Yes.
Thank you.
So the question is, we are talking about a lost decade. So I want to ask Madam Sharma, what do you think are the 3 points from your point of view and 3 points from the EU point of view are stopping this bilateral agreement? That's number 1. And 1 to Peter.
That's all.
Yeah.
1 to Peter, that's all. After that,
Yeah, 1 to Peter is, I don't agree that, EU and India differ much in international negotiations except for the problem trade. Because in the climate conference, they go on so well. In many of the other agreements, they go on so well, except only trade and justice in the recent one, EICC. So, I don't know why in case of trade, it gets blocked up. Maybe it is a historical legacy that Indians are afraid that once Europeans come to this, they probably will expand. So that is our second question.
thank you. The back.
I also have 2 questions. One is both are related to trade. So, isn't it better?
Can you please identify yourself?
Yeah, Ranveer Nair from Europe India Foundation for Excellence. Yeah, and first is that for the FTA between India and EU, isn't it better that first EU resolves the Brexit issue? So we know exactly where we stand, how much EU has to offer on the table, rather than India concluding a deal and then suddenly realizing that 27 plus 1 was already, that 1 was a major factor which is missing. And second, I get a feeling from the presentation made by the European Commission that they are treating India and European Union on equal footing in commercial terms, which seems a bit unfair because we are still home to the world's largest percentage of very, very poor people. So how do you, at just 350 or 400 million people living below the poverty line, vis-a-vis 470 or 500 million, the richest people in the world?
Thank you very much. There was one last question. The one gentleman here.
Hi, this is a question for Madi.
Please identify.
Yeah, Osama Keem from the European Parliament. You talk about human rights abuses by Pakistan. That's agreed by other NGOs, etc. But what about the ongoing human rights violations in Indian occupied Kashmir? Some say close to 100,000 people have died since 1989. Many NGOs have actually went on to say that the EU should limit trade with India until India adheres to the international law on human rights. What's your views on that?
Okay, fine. Yeah. Very good. Would you can you start? Yeah. The first question is.
Yes. Skills. Okay. We are still developing new techniques on how to teach these new skills. Okay, because we know that the skills that we have, the techniques of teaching skills today are not going to be the ones that we will be needing. So, in a way, giving tools for everyone to be able to be more autonomous in their own learning process is a must, okay? And then at the same time, there are sessions that usually help people work this together as a social small group. And there are certain Finnish techniques in Finland of new university that don't use professors, and they own students without, just a guidance of maybe an accelerator of sessions are in the process of learning, and they get their degrees exactly the same as if they had a traditional. So there are many different schools right now testing different ways of discovering new possibilities for the future of education.
Thank you. Peter?
Okay, 3 questions. Why is everything working but not trade? We have a strategic partnership with India that is clearly spelled out in the last summit, where many initiatives were endorsed by the leaders. Traditionally, the trade relationship with our partner countries is always more contentious than other areas. I'm always the bad guy when I go with my colleagues from the External Action Service to meetings with third countries, because I have the problems I bring. And the question is often easier to solve if you have economies that are complementary. If you have competing economies, then of course the more competitors you are, the more difficult it will get. But this is something which is trade negotiators are there for and highly paid to solve that in Britain. On Brexit, just the UK is of course in touch already with the Indian authorities to see how the future would look like. Officially, of course, they are not authorized to engage in negotiations with third countries, including India, on the future relationship, especially on the free trade area. As you remember, half a year ago, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office came out with a new paper, The Commonwealth Revisited, or something like that, which didn't go down well in India, I understand, but they have learned their lesson. And they, looking at people, trade negotiators, they start from scratch. It's a huge exercise for them to build up their expertise again, or rebuild it. Last point, the different levels of development between India and the European Union. Clearly, I mean, there are difference of developments, and I learned yesterday that GDP growth is slowly overtaking in India the GDP growth of China, but it will still take time until the PPP will, the wealth will overtake that of China. But in our immediate effort for negotiations for an FTA, like we always do when we negotiate with developing countries, we have tools to reflect that different level of development. This needs to be negotiated, and we're listening, of course, to Indians' demands and what they want to hear, what they have to have in that free trade agreement. And such tools are, for example, longer transition periods for certain commitments to make it easier for India to adjust to what we want to achieve in this FTA.
Thank you.
So it's become a standard line from the Pakistanis now that as soon as an Indian mentions human rights abuses in Pakistan, or human rights abuses are brought up anywhere in Brussels about human rights abuses in Pakistan, Pakistanis will always raise the issue of Kashmir. So we don't develop that dialogue anymore. I would just ask you to first sort out your issues in Balochistan before you start interfering in anything else. Going back to the EU-India FTA, the three things that I would say. First of all, neither side understands the other. I have one foot in Europe and one foot in India because my father is Punjabi Indian, my mother is Austrian, my grandfather was Polish. I understand both cultures. I understand that an Indian can't say no. I understand what it means when you take businesses to India. You have to educate them first to know what is expected when they get on the ground. So that's the first thing. Both sides don't understand each other, and I don't think they really want to. The second thing is what the gentleman said at the back, is the understanding the poverty levels of India and that 860 million people are on less than $2 a day. However, what Europe is also missing, and this is the major fact, that there are 400,000 highly educated English-speaking Indians in India, which will solve the problems of the European Union through their ideas, through the innovations, and so we have got to work together. And my third point is the fact that there is the hypocrisy of the European Union. In its dealings with Pakistan, in its dealings with China, there is no trade agreement between India and China, between Europe and China, and yet trade is happily going on. There are human rights abuses. I mean, Peter just listed that if India wants to go through this trade agreement, it's going to have to do the labour standards. There aren't any labour standards in Pakistan that are being adhered to. The international conventions are being broken. Why are we having this double standards? I'm proud to be European. I don't want this double standards, and this, I think, is also part of the problem. I don't understand why. We can find compromises when we're dealing with China so that China saves face and Europe saves face. Look at the issues with the market economy status with China. Both sides are going to find a solution. Why can we not find a solution to do a great trade agreement between Europe and India?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all the three speakers and just focus on the agenda. Now, I don't think it's a lost decade. You very rightly pointed out that the Doha Development Agenda has been going on for a longer period at the WTO. Currently, the international trade arena is a great difficulty, considering the kind of noises being made by Donald Trump. He'd be happy to even, he has unraveled TTP, got out of it, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And there was already an agreement on that. Now the 11 of the rest are probably planning to go ahead with it. There was a deal between Europe and US, which is again gone for a 6, to use a cricket terminology. Thirdly, what is important is that both EU and India, at the moment after that summit particularly, many of these things only happen due to political will. And there is clearly what I see as sign of political will, particularly when the international trade arena is itself shrinking, that countries find it necessary for their own sake, for their own selfish interests, to get into one or the other trade agreements. One very big trade agreement which India is negotiating with, of which 8 are common members of the TPP, Japan, Australia, etc., etc. It's called the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement between India, ASEAN, and 3 others, which includes China. And China is the elephant in the room, not India, which is the elephant in the room. Yet, and the others don't want India out of this agreement, in spite of all its. The Indian negotiators, in my own humble opinion, are very difficult, for the simple reason that even the industry is very diffident. They are not very clear about what are the prospects of future trade. We've burnt our hands in several areas. I'm not looking at history of East India Company, as was pointed out in the European countries. No, not that. Those days are gone. You can't have East India Company repeat again. But the fact is that there is a political will as it stands. And what the negotiators have to see, in my own opinion, is to see is what is achievable and try to achieve that. When you say win-win, a lot of people don't realize that it appears to be win-lose. That is the reason why things don't move forward. What we did in the Yoga round, if you remember, Peter, is that there are a lot of issues which we put in as built-in agenda. And we'll talk about it later. Let's get done with this. And it was not a shallow agreement, mind you. It's a pregnant agreement, in the sense that some of these issues on which there will be difficulty in agreeing to any particular standard. India has ratified all ILO conventions, etc., etc. And we try to do our best, but as was pointed out, poverty itself is a great deflector in this kind of thing. People they want a job rather than not having any job at all. And that often then leads them to get into kind of occupations which are not desirable. But anyway, I don't want to get into those kind of social issues at this point, but to focus on the agenda is that I don't think it's a lost decade. It may take another 5 years, but as I said, the circumstances today are more propitious than they were before, particularly because WTO is not going to go anywhere at all. And I'm going to Buenos Aires from here for the ministerial conference, and I'm told the only thing which is likely to happen there is an agreement on fisheries subsidies. And all other issues may get a working party or may not see any kind of agreement at all. So given that circumstances, I see very promising the EU-India FTA, and there might be a Commonwealth Free Trade Agreement also, you never know. So we're all in for a good time. With that, let me thank you very much, and if may I request you to please give a big hand to our 3 panelists. Sorry, Sunil, I don't think you could have done justice.
I'm Mark Stassen. I'm a lawyer specialized in privacy and data protection. And I'm a very happy person in the sense that I drive to work every morning knowing that I'll be working on one of the two big boardroom buzzwords of these days. One of them is blockchain, that was mentioned before in panel. And the other one is GDPR, which is what I'm going to tackle today. GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation. And so as it is a European legislation, I really want to give you some insights into why European legislation is relevant for Indian companies. So I'll tackle first of all a bit of an introduction, so getting everyone on the same page so that we all know what we're talking about, a bit back to the basics. Second of all, how to prepare for this GDPR, then some tips and tricks, and we'll end with a Q&A session. So first of all, GDPR, what is it about? It's about the future. GDPR is the future, and it is in fact the very near future. You might have heard that it will be applicable as from May 25th, 2018, so that's really tomorrow. So I hope most of you already heard of GDPR. If not, I hope after this session you have an idea of why you should be thinking about it. So it's European-wide legislation on the use of personal data. And so personal data is in fact every information that relates to an identified or an identifiable person. So it could be the obvious, what I call the obvious personal data. So it's my name, it's my birth date, it's my address, a picture of mine indeed. It could also be indirect information, which is, for example, an IP address. You could say an IP address refers to a computer. I have a wife and two sons, so I mean every one of us could be working that computer, but that's also personal data protected by this legislation. Also a description. You could say a male person between 30 and 40 years old. That doesn't really describe someone, so that's not in scope of this legislation. This is also why, if you want to be out of scope, you want to try to anonymize the information. But if you're going to say, well, it's a gentleman of a GDPR specialist of around 37 years, who drives a black car and lives around the area of Leuven, you might indeed have identified the person, so that's also in scope of this legislation. And so when is it in scope? So what you're treating is the personal data, and when is it in scope? When you process personal information. In fact, if you want to know what processing is, it's in fact everything you do with personal data. I've just put here some of the things that you could say. It's a collection of personal data, but it's also looking at the information, it's storing the information. So everything you do with personal data is in scope of this legislation. Of course, why you might have heard of it and why it has become a boardroom topic is perhaps the next thing, is the sanctions. So there are possible sanctions up to 20 million euros or 4% of a group's worldwide annual turnover. So that's huge. I mean, if you start calculating, that's kind of, for many companies, their margin, their annual margin totally gone. But of course, for me, I mean, I won't be the one saying that your company will be the first one having such a 4% worldwide turnover fine, because I feel it's a bit like cheap consultant speak. I mean, I think what is more impacting from an operational point of view is what a regulator will be able to do. So they will be able to do investigations, but also to issue warnings, reprimands, orders. So from a reputational point of view, I think the impact is really big. But from the operational point of view, if a regulator would tell you, well, I'm not really confident with how you process personal data, let's just stop for a moment until I feel comfortable. I mean, if that's your core business, processing that information, that's really huge from an operational point of view. So what is applicable? Because indeed, European legislation, so still, why should Indian companies care? Well, first of all, it applies for all processing of information in the context of an establishment in the European Union, even when the processing takes place outside of the European Union. So in India, indeed, there's a lot of expertise and expert knowledge, and a lot of European companies are using that expertise in back offices, but also in parts and departments of their companies. So that means if Indian companies are working for European companies, so in the context of the establishment of the company in the EU, it is already in scope. And when you're not established in the European Union, that is when but you focus your goods and services to individuals within the European Union, or you monitor behavior within the European Union, it also in scope. And this is really a factual thing, which is why I also put the goods and service. How you can know that is, for example, if your website is in Dutch, that can only be directed to people in Belgium and in Flanders or in the Netherlands. So that means that you're focusing or offering terms of goods and services to individuals within the European Union. Also, if you allow people to pay for your services in euros, that also shows that if you're not established in the European Union, it still will apply to any companies. So there's a big distinction, and bear with me for a moment because this is an important one. There's a difference between a controller and a processor. So in short, a controller is the entity that determines what happens with the personal data. So the ownership of the data always remains with the individual. As you might know, personal data, so the protection of personal data is an individual right in the European Union, so the ownership always remains with the individual, but the entity that decides what to do with the information is called a controller. For example, the employer. So you determine what you do with the personal data of your employees, and there's no third party that determines what else you can do with it. There's some direct obligations coming from that controllership, and of course also some restrictions. And the other one, so you have the controller, the other one is the processor, and that's a typical role for Indian companies too. As I said, there's a lot of expertise there, so working on behalf of the controllers. So so you just follow the instructions of the controller, and then the legislation applies to you. That means that you have not only the indirect obligations, I mean you need to follow the instructions of the controllers, we also have some direct obligations. I'll come back to that in a moment. So first of all, if you look at the controller, what are these obligations? First of all, you should be able to demonstrate compliance with the GDPR. So that means that if you're not able to demonstrate compliance, you're already not compliant. And this is a big game changer in the sense that before you could say there's already a legislation in place right now, it's European directive, which has been implemented in different member states. Now this will be a regulation which will directly be applicable in the European Union and also with the extraterritorial scope I just mentioned. When there was an investigation, you kind of had the moment to go and look whether I'm compliant or not. So this accountability effect means that if somebody challenges you, your pile of documents to show that you're compliant needs to be ready, needs to be there. So that's kind of a mindset changer. And people often ask me, okay, what is in fact what you're doing here, privacy law or GDPR? What's the difference between privacy and security? Because these are the two big aspects. Well, for me, security is in fact, do I have access to the data? While privacy is about, should I have access to the data? Am I in fact entitled to use that information? This is with part of the controller, because the controller is the entity that has to demonstrate that in fact we're allowed to have that information. So there's a lot of principles, and the main ones are, first of all, you need to show that the use of the data is lawful, fair, and transparent. So that means that you need to have a legal ground. For example, in the example of the employer, the legal ground you have there is necessary. You need the data that are necessary for the execution of a contract, which is the employment contract. That of course means that that specific legal ground doesn't apply if you're going to use the same data set for other purposes. For example, you have a picture which you might be using for the employment file, but if you're going to use that picture for some marketing purpose of your own company, it's the same data set, then the specific legal ground doesn't apply anymore. Purpose limitation is another important one, so it means that you can only use the data for one specific purpose. So a one-size-fits-all purpose, like you often see on the internet, that just doesn't work. I don't know if you know the biggest lie on the internet, what that is. I hereby confirm that I have read and understood all the 75 pages of general terms and conditions. That's because it's just not valid in the sense that the purpose is way too wide. So you need to be very specific about what am I going to do with that information. Data minimization is another aspect of it, which means that you can only use the personal data these are necessary and really specifically required for that specific purpose. So in the sense, for example, if you look at these security badges that most companies have, and I'm using HR example because most of you have, we all have employees, so should you put a name on such a badge? So that's in the data minimization principle, you need to think about, okay, do I really need it? No, I need for security badge, I can understand and I can defend that I need a picture, because then a guard at the door can recognize you and compare it. But if that guard cannot ask you for your passport because they just are not entitled to do it, it's just police powers, then they cannot compare your name with the name on the badge, so it doesn't make sense to put the badge there. So that's about data minimization, only really what is limited to the purpose. Accuracy means that you need to have accurate information, and storage limitation, that's in fact the biggest difficult one. It's already under the directive, but under the regulation there's a lot more focus on it. You can only keep information for as long as required for the purpose for which you have collected that information. And many companies I talk to, they just say, well, we keep information forever, you know, just in case. And that's a difficult one, because, I mean, you shouldn't be having that information at that stage. So it's what I mentioned about privacy, should you still have that information? And that's a difficult one because the IT mindset is totally different. I mean, I don't know how many IT specialists are here in the room, but an IT person has always been asked not to lose the information. Information needs to be available, have some backup, some offline backup, make sure you don't lose it. Now systems need to be built to delete the information. Systems are not built like that. So you see that a lot of your clients will say, okay, when will you delete the information, and how do you have a process in place, do you have capabilities in your system to do that? And security, what I mentioned before, is that you need to have the right integrity and confidentiality, the right technical and organizational measures to defend where the data is. So the processor, that's the other big one, is in fact, you should comply with the instructions of the controller, and that's really important to have that in writing, because it needs to be clear both for the controller and the processor what you can do with the information. And it's relevant because if you would do something more outside of the instructions of the controller, you might become a controller yourself and also get the fines that might be imposed on the controller. So that's a big distinction. You also have some own obligations and restrictions. First of all, GDPR, if GDPR applies to companies outside of the European Union, you need to designate a representative. So this also applies to controls, but let me just now focus on what specific obligations for the processors. You also need to have that contract, that document. I mean, it doesn't say it needs to be written, but it needs to be a contract and a binding act between the controller and the processor. So the C2P, you see that's a controller to processor, but also from the processor to the sub-processor. So if you are going to have a subcontractor, you also need to have that these obligations in a legal act. Furthermore, you cannot do any subcontracting without prior authorization of your controller. And the idea is, in fact, that the controller has the obligation to look for processors that really protect the information the way they want to do it. Then, of course, you cannot, that cannot be at risk by choosing another sub-processor or subcontractor that doesn't have the same obligations or restrictions. You also need to have a record, so an overview of processing activities that you do on behalf of the controller. And for me, this is a quite important one. So if companies ask me where should we start, and I'll come back to kind of the priorities of GDPR action plan, I always say, don't give regulators the possibility to tell you, how can you say that you protect personal data if you don't know where they are, if you don't know what you do with it? So the first thing they will ask you, apart from it being an obligation, is show me some data mapping, show me a record of processing activities, which is what's called for a controller, and a record of categories of processing activities, so knowing what you do for the controller is really important obligation. Also, the technical and organizational measures, that's a direct obligation upon the processor, so it's no longer possible to say, oh, I'm just a processor, I just implement the technical and organizational measures that my contractor, so my controller asks me. No, you need to be, as a processor, sure that your technical and organizational measures are sufficient to protect personal data. Furthermore, there's a data breach notification, so on the hand of the controller, they will have to notify, in many cases, the regulator, and in some cases, even individuals. Well, you as a processor, if you process that on behalf of the controller, you have the obligation to notify the controller if something happened, if a breach happened. Then there's a lot to do about data protection officers. I don't know if you heard that discussion about how the GDPR creates a new category of a profession, data protection officer. And in fact, when companies ask me, do we need to designate a data protection officer, and many times the official answer is no. I don't think that's the right question, because in fact you will de facto need a data protection officer, at least somebody responsible and liable, well, liable, that's a company, but responsible for overview and compliance with the GDPR. Because what if an individual asks your company, do you have information about me? Who's going to answer that? If one of your clients asks you, how are you processing personal data, because it's important for me in the EU, there's strict legislation, who's going to answer that? And about the rights of the individuals go really, really far. And you should know, you might have heard about the Costera Gonzalez case, the right to be forgotten in the Google, the Spain case. So many individuals are more and more conscious of their rights. So any individual walking around in the street can ask you, do you have information about me? And you as a company, you need to know, and you need to tell them. So what we're fearing, in fact, as May 25, that there will be kind of legal DDoS attacks. I don't know if you know DDoS attacks, the distributed denial of service attacks. So what happens, in fact, from a technical point of view, a hacker attacks a lot of computers. All these computers send requests to a website, and the website just goes down because it cannot handle the traffic. Well, in this case, just imagine that after 25th of May, and again, it already exists today, but it will be more punished if you don't comply. If somebody on the internet, on Twitter, so for example, says, let us all ask this big company whether they have information about it. So one single request is not that difficult. If you get 25 million or 20,000 even, it just, it's too many requests, and the system, in this case, the legal office, just goes down. So that's really a big risk that companies need to take into account. Then, of course, there's international data transfer. So we talked a lot about the free flow of goods, but also about information. So within the European Union, there's a free flow of information and personal data. But data cannot leave the European Union unless there's some specific things. I just mentioned here a few. When you have consent of the individual, but that's very strict, and we can do a whole session on just consent. There's standard contractual clauses, which is a contract between the exporting and the importing entity, and there's binding corporate rules within the same group. So this is something that you need to take into account. Do I have that in place, and am I processing information here in India with one of these legitimations or one of these mechanisms to transfer the data outside of European? So very quick on how to prepare. So a GDPR action plan is just more than a quick to-do list. It needs to be a tailored, risk-based, and prioritized plan, because it just doesn't make sense to make one list. It needs to be, in fact, first of all, you need to know where am I right now? What's my current state of compliance? And you would say the GDPR is only the future. No, under the current legislation, you might already have a lot in place, because the directive and the implementing legislation already, imposes a lot of things, even sometimes 85–90% of what's in GDPR was already in place, including asking for information about what do you have about me. But then also you need to decide, you as a company, okay, how am I going to tackle this? What's my target maturity? Because you might say, okay, I just want to avoid a fine. But in some cases you might say, I want to go one step further. I want to be best in class because it's my employees' data, it's my clients' data, and just for me it needs to be one step further. And also, one-sided list doesn't make sense. You need to make dependencies. So one, with work streams that work in parallel. So if one starts, then the other one can only start. If one can only start, if the other one finishes. So it needs to make sense, such an action. And of course, also an estimate of your efforts. Well, in full-time equivalent, not in cost. And then you can really decide as a company, do I want to outsource it to someone else, or can I do it myself? Can I free up some people to do the work? So some priorities, first of all, GDPR governance. If you want to have a plan, what should I tackle? Well, you won't be able to be 100% compliant, not even in 10 years, because there's always some challenges. Privacy is it's not about black and white, it's about gray. And in this case, it's not being in the dark gray office. So GDPR governance, what I mentioned before, a DPO, you might not be obliged to have a DPO, but at least there needs to be some kind of governance structure in place. There needs to be a strategy and a vision. There needs to be clear tone from the top, but also a division DPO, GDPR office or something like that. I already mentioned the data mapping. Make sure that you know what you're processing and where everything is based. And just don't focus on what do I have, but also on the entire data life cycle. So that's from how do data come in, what do I do with them, do I share it with third parties, how do I store it, and how do I delete it, because it's also quite important. Also the ownership and the obligations versus the rights. And I think that's an important one, because we see a lot of companies saying, okay, there's very strict rights from individuals, so let's just give them everything they want. And then you come to absurd situations in an HR context, for example. Let's say that somebody heard about the right to be forgotten, and somebody has 2 bad assessments, 2 years in a row, very bad assessments, and after the 3rd bad assessment, they throw me out. So I go to the HR department and I say, I heard something about right to be forgotten, I want that to be deleted out of my file. So if you don't know which rights are against your obligations or which obligations against the rights, you might say, okay, let's delete it out of the file, but that's not true. Because in this case, you're not relying on consent as a legal ground, you rely on the legitimate interest as an employer to have these kind of assessments, and therefore, I mean, if they haven't given their consent, they cannot withdraw their consent. But if you don't know that, which rights are against your rights, that's quite challenging. Transparency is also important, and there the threshold is, it needs to be in line with the expectations of the individual. So make sure you're very transparent about what you're going to do with information before you collect it. Privacy by design, it's another one of these buzzwords. You have privacy by design and by default. It's in fact from the first napkin moment, and it's in fact in Belgium we say the card that you put your beer on, but from the first idea you have that you write it down on a napkin, you need to think about privacy. But also in your systems and in your processes, privacy needs to be built in. It needs to be, compliant with GDPR. Data transfers, we already mentioned that it's not only the external data transfer, but also internal. To which department do I send information? To which third parties do I send it? But also the third parties working for us. Which are the roles and responsibilities? If I'm just processing information, let's say I have cloud space, storage, purely storage, and I just do that for you as a company. Well, make sure it's very clear what you can do with it. Because what we see a lot is there's a lot of specialization in your company. And so if you just process information in the back office for another company, some smart person in your company from sales or marketing department might say, well, we have all that information from so many different companies from the same type of organization. Why don't we bundle it all, and why don't we sell it, or why don't we use it in our own big data analytics? Well, that's something that we need to be clearly described, because if you don't have these restrictions in a contract, it might not be clear and might be a risk for the liability. And security measures, of course, they need to be appropriate to the risks. For me, this is also quite important one, that you take into account what you're going to do. And if you don't have these eyes and ears on the ground, if you don't have people who know what lives on the ground, then you might have situations like your IT person saying, look, we're going to implement a rollout of iPads. We give everyone an iPad, all our salespeople, they have an iPad. And because it's such a danger, because it's lost in a taxi, in a train, it always happens, it gets stolen, we're going to protect it very securely, encrypted, but also the encryption of the transfer, the data transfer. Well, I can tell you, if the server is so well protected and the connection too, the first time that one of your salesperson is in a meeting and needs to enter into that meeting and wants to change something to their presentation, or to their pitch or whatever, and they can't access the file because it's so protected, I can assure you next time you just send it to their Hotmail address and they access it that way. So you need to make sure that you know what the risks are within your business, and you need to make sure that you also have your security measures appropriate to these risks. Training and awareness, I think, is even the most important one, because your strongest assets, your employees, they might also become your weakest links. Because the example I just gave about the individual sending it to the Hotmail address, it often happens because they want to do their job well. They want to go to that pitch and they had just a one-liner and they said, I want to add it because I really need to, that will make a sale. So you need to make sure that you understand that they're aware of the risks of sending it to a Hotmail address, and to have other measures, etc., etc. So that's quite important one, the awareness creation. Just to end with some tips and tricks, for the controllers and processors both, you can use the GDPR as a USP, as a unique selling proposition. I mean, you will see, and you will have seen in your companies, that there's a lot of GDPR questionnaires nowadays. Privacy questionnaires, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, nobody talked about privacy. Well, the directive already existed, but nowadays you see it happening a lot. All your clients are sending you questionnaires to see how compliant are you with the GDPR. So why don't you take it as a different way instead of just waiting until they ask it? Why don't you take a more proactive approach? Why don't you say, look, I mean, this is the way I am compliant, and I'm going to use that in my the way I sell my products and my services. Also, use GDPR. You have to do that data mapping anyway. Well, use it to increase your knowledge of how your company works. And you might even, you might come to the conclusion that a lot of processes just are not necessary anymore. How many times have I seen companies that said, well, we hadn't done this revision in the context of GDPR, and in fact there was a nightly or a daily batch going to a third-party provider. The contract doesn't exist anymore. We don't even know who they are. There's half of our database going there. So this is really a huge, huge risk, of course. So make sure, I mean, that way, from a technical point of view, from an operational point of view, from a procedural point of view, you get to know your company as a result of GDPR. As I said, Involve the business. Make sure that you have eyes and ears on the ground, that you find out, okay, what's the risks within my company. When I give these awareness trainings in companies, I always say, look, if you just feel bad when you drive home and you saw that on the printer, there was still someone's personal information or somebody's salary slip. If you just feel bad, already I accomplished what I want. It would have been better if you just took it away and you destroyed it or did something else with it. But at least you need to have the mindset switch with your employees, that they understand what the risks are to any specific processing operation. What you can't do is, when you want to get to know your business and you send around these questionnaires, which you then also see, don't talk legalese. I mean, here individuals in the official text it says data subjects. I just talked to you about controller, processor. But don't ask expert questions to non-experts. I mean, many times I see, on which legal basis are you processing that information? And you ask that to somebody of IT, marketing, sales, and they just say, I don't know, consent, I assume, because that's what I know from the internet, ticking the box or somehow. That is not mostly, I mean, consent is in fact the legal ground, that is the weakest one. Because first of all, if it's withdrawn, then all your system falls apart, and you cannot process the information anymore. But also it needs to be informed, explicit consent, etc., so very difficult to get. So don't ask these questions to people who should not know, but ask, why are you using the information for? And if they say, well, I have the bank account information of my employees, and I do it for the payment of their salaries, then you yourself can come to the conclusion that the legal ground you have is the execution of a contract. Also, give them business-specific examples. So in sales and marketing, it's a totally different way of processing information than the information of employees, etc. Also, use GDPR to get control over your data. Because what I see often is I hear a lot about big data. For me, big data sounds a lot 90s. In fact, big data it was the idea of you have a lot of information and that's really useful. Well, no, for me it's more about smart data. It's really about what do I really need. So I see often marketing teams, they say, well, let's send an email to all our database. And is the database so valid and valuable because it's like 30, 40 years of people within there? And then I always challenge them. I say, what's the return on investment or the ROI on that marketing campaign? And if they come back with 1.2 or 2.5, then I say, well, are you sure that this is the right level of detail? Is it the right person? Is that data accurate? And if you do really a cleansing exercise, you make sure that the data you have is really the right one, then you're going to think smart in a smart way. Because what is really important, the mindset change you need to make, is that data has moved from being an asset to being a liability. If you know that every single data set you have is linked to a risk of 4% of your worldwide turnover, again, I'm not saying that you're the Google or Facebook that will have, or that might have these big fines, but there's a lot of risk behind it. So it's no longer an asset, it's a liability. So think if you really want to keep it and take that risk. You can also use GDPR. There's a lot of communication around. You can't open your inbox or you get from consultancy firms or law firms invitations for seminars on GDPR. So why don't you use that buzz all around it to create awareness amongst your employees, because they will also want to know if there's such a strict legislation, how is my employer dealing with that? So they want to know how you protect their data, and then they know, okay, if they do it that way, then we will do the same with our customers' information. Understand your business-specific risks, which is what I mentioned about the iPad example, to make sure where the risks are and how an employee who wants to do the work will try to circumvent restrictions. On controls specifically, so demonstrate compliance to the individuals, which I mentioned are called data subjects, and assign purpose owners. So if you do your data mapping, it's really important to have, for each purpose, an owner. And it might be somebody in HR for recruitment. It might be somebody from within marketing for sending emails to prospects, etc. But there needs to be an owner per purpose. And do not make the mistake of many companies that say, well, the owner is the application owner, and the application owner always comes back to IT. But IT doesn't know what's in the system. They might know the security measures, but they don't know whether that information should be there, whether I'm entitled, whether I have a legal ground to have that information in the system. So make sure you have a purpose owner when you do your data mapping. Also take a holistic approach. Companies are, as you know, they're divided in silos. But data, they move between silos horizontally, so you need to make a general view of how is my company structured and how would data move from one department to the other. What I mentioned before about the obligations, know which obligations are against the individual's rights. So it's not because there's a right to be forgotten that it always applies. It's not that there is something like withdrawing consent that you can ask always, I want you to stop personal information. And specifically for the processors, why don't you proactively assist the controller in demonstrating GDPR compliance? Because when they send you out all these questionnaires, GDPR compliance, is because they want to be compliant. So help them, show them, look, this is the way I'm compliant. Have at least a contact point, might be a DPO, privacy champion, whatever, but that they know where can I get to, I mean, whom should I ask when I have privacy or GDPR specific questions. Already describe your technical and organizational measures and make sure you have some kind of a report, might even be a third-party assurance report, which in fact avoids repeated third-party audits, because I can tell you your clients, they will come again and again asking you, not sure whether you're compliant, if you're not compliant, I'm not, so I want to do an audit. Well, if you have an independent third party doing such an audit, you can say, well, I understand why you're worried. Well, this is what an independent third party has assessed. And then you can avoid a lot of operational issues of, well, now we have to stop our business to let these people in, etc. Voilà, so there's a lot of things. I just had half an hour, so I could talk hours and days about this. But are there specific...
During lunch, you will have some question and answer.
Wonderful. If you have questions during lunch, a lot of opportunities to do so. Thank you.
Let's go for lunch now and just... So lunch is going to be only for 45 minutes. So we will reassemble here at 1 o'clock, at 2 o'clock, if I say 2 o'clock, and then we have a session from Mr. Christopher Hamid. I just wanted to also inform you that the whole session, right from the beginning, from the inauguration, is being live streamed in the Facebook and YouTube. Only YouTube. So you can watch the YouTube and you can see everything that's going on live. Yeah.